In the latest operating update, the Bureau of Reclamation confirmed that Lake Powell will release only 6 million acre-feet during water year 2026, 1.48 million acre-feet below the volume originally projected for Lake Mead. One signal would be unusual. Several signals together are harder to dismiss. Reclamation is holding more water behind Glen Canyon Dam. Between 660,000 and 1 million additional acre-feet is being moved from Flaming Gorge Reservoir toward Powell. The probable minimum forecast placed Powell inflow near 31% of average. And every acre-foot retained upstream is an acre-foot that does not arrive at Mead on the earlier schedule. But that is not the most dangerous part. The headline is the 6 million acre-foot release. The hidden number is the recovery margin Lake Mead loses, while federal operators protect critical elevations at Lake Powell. This is not just a release cut. This is a reservoir balance failure. Two of the largest storage facilities in the United States are no longer being managed as deep reserves that can rescue the entire river system together. They are being managed as connected, emergency accounts, with water shifted to keep one account from crossing a critical line while the other absorbs the cost. So the question is no longer simply whether Lake Powell rises or Lake Mead falls. The question is, what happens when protecting one dam begins tightening the operating margin for power systems, farms, cities, tribal communities, and water agencies downstream? Like, subscribe, and comment where you are watching from, because these reservoir maps are showing more than falling water. They are showing where the next system constraint may emerge first. The decision did not begin with an empty reservoir. It began with a forecast that kept getting smaller. Early in the operating day, the Bureau of Reclamation was not watching a single gauge or reacting to one alarming photograph. Its operators were looking across a chain of measurements that begins hundreds of miles upstream from Glen Canyon Dam. Snow water content in the mountains, soil moisture beneath the snow, forecast temperatures, the timing of runoff, river flows entering the upper basin, storage at Flaming Gorge, storage at Lake Powell, the elevation of Lake Mead, power production at two major dams, and the amount of water that must still move through the system before the water year ends. Each number occupied its own line. Together, they described a river producing less room for error. By spring, the official projections had moved far enough that the operating plan itself had to change. Lake Powell had been scheduled to release 7.48 million acre-feet during water year 2026. Reclamation reduced that volume to 6 million acre-feet through the end of September. The difference was 1.48 million acre-feet. That water would remain in Powell instead of passing through Glen Canyon Dam on its earlier schedule toward Lake Mead. At nearly the same time, another signal appeared upstream. Under the Drought Response Operations Agreement, Reclamation began moving additional water out of Flaming Gorge Reservoir, with a planned volume between approximately 660,000 and 1 million acre-feet through April 2027. That water would travel down the Green River, join the Colorado River, and eventually enter Lake Powell. On their own, these actions could be described as separate adjustments. One reduces water, leaving Powell. The other increases water, moving toward Powell. Together, they reveal the same operational priority. Federal managers are trying to slow Powell's descent toward elevations that could threaten reliable water delivery and power generation. The dashboard therefore shows movement in two directions at once. Water is being pulled toward Powell from an upstream reserve. Water is being held back at Powell instead of being released downstream at the previously expected volume. Lake Powell becomes the protected center of the operation. Lake Mead becomes the place where the missing release appears. But that description still makes the decision sound cleaner than it is. The Colorado River does not move like water between two identical tanks. It passes through a landscape of mountains, canyons, tributaries, farms, cities, tribal lands, wildlife habitat, turbines, diversion structures, and legal obligations. The 6 million acre-foot release is an annual operating volume, not a single gate closure. Reclamation must divide it across months while considering power demand, downstream environmental conditions, maintenance needs, river recreation, and the changing amount of water entering Powell. Every monthly adjustment alters the shape of the hydrograph, the pattern of water moving through the Grand Canyon, and the amount of storage carried from one season into the next. This is why the critical moment was not a dramatic announcement at the dam. It was a change in the operating table. A number that had been 7.48 became 6.0. Once that line changed, every agency downstream had to recalculate what it meant. Lower basin water managers had to consider a smaller inflow to Mead. Hydropower planners had to account for reduced releases through Glen Canyon Dam and changing hydraulic head. Agricultural districts had to watch the probability of future shortage tiers. Cities had to revisit conservation plans that may not be triggered today, but depend on reservoir projections several seasons ahead. Tribal communities had to follow another emergency decision on a river, where legal entitlement and physical access are still not the same thing. Recreation businesses around Powell and Mead had to consider how changing elevations could affect ramps, marinas, access roads, and visitor patterns. None of those systems necessarily failed on the day the release was reduced. That is what makes the signal easy to underestimate. The first effect of a reservoir emergency is often administrative. A forecast changes. A release table changes. A planning assumption disappears. Only later does that change arrive as a physical constraint. By late spring, the worsening pattern was visible in the inflow forecasts. The probable minimum scenario for water year 2026 placed unregulated inflow to Lake Powell near 3 million acre-feet, roughly 31% of average. Later observations could improve or worsen that estimate, and the most probable scenario was higher. But emergency planning cannot depend only on the middle forecast. Operators must also ask, what happens if the dry edge of the forecast range becomes real? That is the purpose of the probable minimum case. It is not a prediction that must occur, it is a stress test for the system. And the stress test was severe enough to justify action before the lowest outcome arrived. This is the abnormal pattern. The basin was not simply having a dry month. Water year projections had deteriorated after operating assumptions were already in place. The runoff season, which normally provides the major annual pulse into Powell, was not delivering the volume the system had expected. Reclamation had already begun adjusting monthly releases in December of 2025 to retain more water at Powell. The later reduction to 6 million acre-feet was therefore not the first warning. It was the escalation of an existing response. One signal would be unusual. Several signals together are harder to dismiss. Monthly releases were adjusted. The annual release was cut. Flaming Gorge was activated as an upstream support reservoir. Powell inflow forecasts remained far below average. And the official justification repeatedly returned to the same vulnerable functions: reliable water delivery and hydropower generation. If this were only about the appearance of a shrinking lake, the response would not require coordinated releases across multiple federal reservoirs. The operation exists because elevation determines what the dam can do. Water stored high behind Glen Canyon, dam creates pressure that drives turbines and supports controlled releases through the power plant. As the reservoir falls, that hydraulic head declines. Power output becomes less efficient. The margin above critical infrastructure narrows. At still lower elevations, operators would face increasingly difficult choices about how to move water through the dam. The map shows a lake. The operations room sees a machine losing working range. Yet the machine downstream matters too. Lake Mead is the primary storage reservoir for the lower Colorado River system. It supports deliveries associated with Arizona, California, Nevada, and Mexico, while Hoover Dam produces electricity for customers across the Southwest. A smaller release from Powell does not instantly remove water from a particular city. Mead also receives tributary inflows below Glen Canyon Dam, and its elevation is affected by releases, diversions, conservation, evaporation, and return flows. But the main regulated contribution from Powell remains fundamental. Reduce that contribution, and the downstream reservoir begins its own accounting period, with less help than previously planned. This is the operational contradiction. lighting the dashboard. Powell needs more storage to protect its functions. Mead needs inflow to protect its own. The system can move water between them, but it cannot manufacture the missing runoff. The additional water from Flaming Gorge may slow Powell's decline. The reduced Powell release may hold another 1.48 million acre-feet upstream. Those actions create time, but they create it unevenly. An upstream reservoir gives up storage. Powell retains storage. Mead receives less water than the earlier schedule indicated. The risk does not disappear. It changes location. And that is why this day is different from an ordinary adjustment in dam operations. The agencies are no longer fine-tuning abundance. They are allocating protection inside scarcity. Every action has a visible benefit and a downstream cost. Every gallon placed behind one line on the map is absent from another line until the operating balance changes again. The warning is not that every tap in the southwest is about to run dry. The warning is that the reserve system built to absorb bad years is now using one reserve to defend another while reducing the recovery opportunity of a third. The dashboard is not flashing one red light. It is showing a sequence. Less runoff enters the upper basin. Flaming Gorge releases additional water. Powell retains a larger share. Mead receives a smaller annual release. Downstream agencies inherit a tighter margin. And behind all of those movements sits the number that now controls the story. 6 million acre-feet sounds enormous. But to understand why it changed the direction of risk across the basin, we have to measure not only how much water it represents, but how much water is missing beside it. 6 million acre-feet sounds like a number too large to picture, and that is precisely why its meaning can disappear. An acre-foot is the volume required to cover 1 acre of land with 1 foot of water. It equals approximately 325,851 gallons. Multiply that by 6 million, and the annual release from Lake Powell approaches 1,955 billion gallons. Spread across a single layer, that amount could cover 6 million acres 1 foot deep. It could cover an area larger than the state of New Jersey. It could fill more than 2,900,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. By almost any everyday comparison, 6 million acre-feet looks immense. But the headline number is not important, because 6 million is small. It is important because it is smaller than the system expected, smaller than the operating plan assumed, and smaller at the exact moment when Lake Mead needs every available increment of recovery. The original water year release was 7.48 million acre-feet. The revised release is 6 million. The difference is 1.48 million acre-feet, or approximately 482 billion gallons. That difference alone is greater than the annual municipal water use of several major American cities combined. Yet even that comparison can mislead. Municipal water use is not identical to reservoir release. Water moving from Powell to Mead serves several purposes along the way. It passes through turbines. It supports river habitat. It moves through the Grand Canyon. It becomes part of a larger accounting system involving diversions, return flows, evaporation, treaty deliveries, agricultural demand, and storage. 1.48 million acre-feet is not a stack of bottled water that could simply be assigned to households. It is operating volume. It is the portion of the river that would have entered the next major reservoir under the earlier schedule, but now remains behind Glen Canyon Dam. The headline is 6 million. The real story is the missing 1.48. To see why that missing volume matters, imagine the Colorado River system as a long emergency staircase. Each reservoir is a landing where water can pause before continuing downward. In a wet period, the landings refill. Operators can release water while preserving enough storage to absorb the next dry season. In a prolonged shortage, each landing grows narrower. The system still moves water, but every step leaves less room to recover. 6 million acre-feet is not simply water traveling downstream. It is the width of one of those steps being reduced. Lake Mead must now continue its own descent and recovery cycle, with less water arriving from the largest controlled source above it. That does not mean Mead will fall by exactly the volume withheld. Its final elevation will depend on many variables, including tributary flows below Glen Canyon Dam, lower basin consumption, conservation, evaporation, rainfall, releases to Lake Mojave, and the timing of deliveries. But it means the baseline has shifted. Before the change, Mead was expected to receive 7.48 million acre-feet from Powell. After the change, it is expected to receive 6 million. The system must find the difference somewhere else, save it through conservation, absorb it through lower storage, or carry it forward as a larger risk. The number is not just water, it is a season being pulled out of position. Reservoir operations are built around timing. Snow accumulates during winter, runoff rises during spring, storage supports releases through summer. The water year ends in September, when operators measure what remains and prepare for the next cycle. A reduction of 1.48 million acre-feet during the same water year changes more than a yearly total. It changes the shape of the months ahead. A reservoir may receive less during the period when managers expected to rebuild storage. It may enter the hottest and highest demand part of the year with less recovery already completed. And it may approach the next winter without the buffer that earlier planning assumed. The difference between 7.4, 8 and 6 is therefore not only a volume, it is time removed from the recovery calendar. That timing becomes even more important when the inflow behind the decision is considered. Reclamation's probable minimum scenario placed water year inflow to Lake Powell near 3.01 million acre-feet, approximately 31% of average. The current operational forecast used an inflow near 3.27 million acre-feet. Under that forecast, Lake Powell was projected to end the water year near elevation 3,510.85 feet, holding about 4.77 million acre-feet in storage, roughly 20% of capacity. These figures are forecasts, not guarantees. A storm sequence, a change in temperature, or revised runoff observations can move them, but operators do not have the luxury of waiting for certainty when a reservoir is approaching a critical operating range. They must act while the future still exists as a range. The 6 million acre-foot decision is the physical expression of that uncertainty. It tells us the dry side of the forecast has become serious enough to alter the release plan. Consider the imbalance in simple terms. If approximately 3.27 million acre-feet flows into Powell during the water year, while 6 million acre-feet is released, the reservoir sends out far more water than the measured natural inflow for that period. Other accounting factors matter, including upstream reservoir releases, local inflows, precipitation, evaporation, and the exact definition of unregulated inflow. Still, the basic pressure is visible. Powell is being asked to deliver water while its primary natural refill is sharply reduced. The additional transfer from Flaming Gorge helps narrow that gap, but it does not erase the basin-wide shortage. It moves stored water from one account to another. This is why 6 million acre-feet can be both enormous and insufficient at the same time. It is enormous to a person. It is insufficient to a system whose legal, agricultural, municipal, environmental, and power obligations were built around much larger historical flows. That contrast is the central scale problem of the Colorado River. The human mind hears trillion gallons and imagines abundance. The reservoir system compares inflow with release and sees depletion. A number can be huge in isolation and dangerous in relation. The visible release remains one of the largest managed movements of water on the continent. But the system does not ask whether 6 million is impressive. It asks whether 6 million is compatible with what came in, what must remain, and what the downstream reservoir requires. And there is another reason the conversion into gallons cannot tell the full story. Reservoir storage is measured vertically as well as volumetrically. When water levels are high, a large surface area means a relatively small change in elevation can represent a substantial amount of water. As the reservoir falls into narrower canyon geometry, the relationship changes. The same acre-foot does not produce the same elevation response at every level. The shoreline contracts. Boat ramps extend farther toward the water. Intake structures, and turbine operating ranges become more exposed. A release decision measured in volume becomes an infrastructure decision measured in feet. That is why Reclamation's forecasts pay close attention to elevation 3,500 feet at Powell. The reduction to 6 million acre-feet was authorized as a tool to help protect Powell when projections showed the reservoir could approach that range. A viewer may see a difference of 1.48 million acre-feet. A dam operator sees the possibility of preserving several crucial vertical feet above a zone where operations become more difficult. Downstream, those same preserved feet become missing inflow to Mead. The water is not destroyed. The risk is transferred. This is the part the headline number conceals. 6 million acre-feet is not a verdict that Powell has been saved or Mead has been sacrificed. It is a temporary allocation of operating margin. It buys space above Glen Canyon Dam's vulnerable elevations. It reduces the space Mead might otherwise have gained. It asks upstream storage at Flaming Gorge to contribute additional water. It gives federal operators more time to watch the next forecasts. But time purchased from storage is not the same as recovery created by runoff. Stored water can be moved once, then it must be replaced. If the following season remains dry, the system returns to the same dashboard with fewer options. The number is not just 6 million acre-feet. It is 1.48 million held back, approximately 482 billion gallons delayed from reaching Mead, several crucial feet defended at Powell, and one more year in which the river's operating plan must be rewritten around shortage instead of normal recovery. But even this still leaves the most important number unexplained. The damage is not determined only by how much Mead receives. It is determined by how much room Mead has left before the next operating threshold becomes unavoidable. The number that determines Lake Mead's danger is not printed in the largest type. It is not 6 million acre-feet. It is not even the 1.48 million acre-feet withheld at Powell. The hidden number is the distance between Lake Mead's surface and the next threshold the system cannot cross without changing how it operates. Reservoir crises are often described as questions of volume: how much water remains, how much arrived, how much was released. But operators also think in elevation, because elevation determines access, pressure, power, and legal response. At Lake Mead, each falling foot can move the system closer to a different set of consequences. Shortage declarations become more severe. Hydropower becomes less efficient. Intake structures lose margin. Emergency plans that once seemed theoretical become active planning documents. The lake does not have to become empty before the system begins to fail. It only has to lose enough operating space that ordinary variation becomes dangerous. This is why the missing 1.48 million acre-feet matters more than its raw size suggests. It is not merely water that Mead will not receive under the earlier schedule. It is recovery that does not occur. It is elevation that may not be regained. It is distance from a threshold that remains narrow. And it is another year in which the reservoir may enter the next runoff season without the buffer managers once expected. The visible number makes the headline. The hidden number writes the damage. To understand that hidden number, imagine a hospital with 100 beds. A report saying that 90 beds are occupied sounds serious, but the real operational question is not how many patients are inside. It is how many beds remain before the next ambulance has nowhere to go. Lake Mead works in a similar way. The total amount of water is important, but the remaining margin is what determines how the system absorbs the next shock. A hot summer, a poor snow season, a delayed monsoon, higher agricultural demand, a failure elsewhere in the water network. Each event consumes part of the margin. If the reservoir begins with deep storage, those shocks can be absorbed without immediate disruption. If the margin is thin, even an ordinary dry year can trigger extraordinary decisions. This is the abnormal pattern now emerging across the Colorado River Basin. The system is not responding only to the current shortage. It is responding to the loss of its ability to recover between shortages. That is a different kind of risk. A drought is an event. Recovery failure is a condition. One may pass with the weather. The other remains inside the infrastructure. Lake Mead's surface elevation does not translate into volume in a simple straight line. The reservoir sits inside a canyon whose shape changes from top to bottom. At higher elevations, the water spreads across a broader area. At lower elevations, it contracts into narrower channels. 1 foot of elevation near the top may contain a different amount of water than 1 foot near the bottom. This means a single acre-foot does not always buy the same vertical distance. The geometry of the reservoir determines how much elevation is gained or lost when storage changes. That geometry is why headlines based only on percentages can mislead. A lake at a certain percentage of capacity may still contain an enormous quantity of water, but the remaining elevation above a critical structure may be uncomfortably small. The total volume can look vast while the operating margin becomes fragile. The map shows water. The dam sees clearance. The difference matters at Hoover Dam because water elevation affects hydraulic head, the pressure created by the height of water above the turbines. As Mead falls, that pressure declines. The turbines can still operate, but they produce less electricity from the same flow. Lower efficiency means the reservoir loses not only water storage, but part of its value as an energy asset. The system then becomes more dependent on replacement power from other sources. Often during periods when heat is already driving, electricity demand higher. A water shortage begins to enter the grid. The event is visible outside. The damage begins inside the operating margin. The hidden number also affects water delivery decisions. Arizona, Nevada, California, and Mexico do not all experience the same reductions at the same time or in the same way. Rules tied to Lake Mead's elevation determine when shortage tiers activate and how deeply certain deliveries are reduced. Some users have senior legal priority. Others carry more exposure. Agricultural districts may face cuts before many urban households notice a change at the tap. Cities may rely on stored reserves, conservation programs, groundwater, or negotiated agreements to delay visible impacts. The first person to feel a lower Mead may therefore not be a homeowner in Las Vegas. It may be a farmer deciding whether a field can be planted. It may be a water manager calculating how much groundwater must replace a reduced surface allocation. It may be a tribal community watching another round of basin negotiations while infrastructure needed to use legally recognized water remains incomplete. The hidden number reaches people through the order in which the system distributes scarcity. That order is not visible in a photograph of the bathtub ring. And there is another concealed variable. It is not only how low Mead becomes, it is how long it remains low. Duration changes everything. A brief decline followed by strong runoff can be managed differently from a multi-year period in which every recovery is partial. Long duration, low storage, increases maintenance difficulty, planning uncertainty, financial pressure, and political conflict. It forces agencies to prepare for several futures at once. One forecast may support current deliveries. Another may require emergency conservation. A third may place infrastructure near a critical threshold. The longer the lake remains low, the more money and institutional attention must be devoted to preventing consequences that have not yet happened. That cost is real even when taps continue to run. It appears in contingency plans, temporary agreements, compensation programs, legal negotiations, engineering studies, and delayed investments elsewhere. The danger is not only low water, it is low water repeated over time. That repetition is what converts a hydrologic shortage into a system condition. The 6 million acre-foot release therefore changes more than Mead's annual balance. It reduces the amount of recovery available before the next cycle begins. If conservation in the lower basin leaves additional water in Mead, that can offset part of the loss. If tributaries contribute more than expected, the result may improve. If demand falls, the lake may decline more slowly. But each of those gains must now work against a smaller release from Powell. They are not building on the earlier 7.48 million acre-foot baseline. They are trying to compensate for its disappearance. This is why a single conservation agreement, even one saving hundreds of thousands of acre-feet, should be understood as valuable but temporary. It buys elevation. It buys planning time. It may delay a shortage tier. But it does not change the underlying arithmetic if long-term use continues to exceed long-term supply. The hidden number is not solved by one transaction because the hidden number is the rate at which margin is consumed. Imagine a household that loses part of its monthly income. It can protect itself for a time by drawing from savings, delaying purchases, or receiving help from relatives. Those actions matter. They may prevent immediate crisis. But if the income loss continues, the question becomes, how many months of savings remain? Lake Mead is the basin's savings account. Powell is another. Flaming Gorge is another. The emergency response, now moving water among them, resembles a family shifting money between accounts to keep the most urgent bill from going unpaid. The transfer can prevent failure. It cannot create new income. The Colorado River's income is runoff. When runoff remains weak, every reservoir rescue draws from storage accumulated in another place or another year. The hidden number is how many such transfers the system can make before the remaining accounts become too small to defend one another. That is the deeper meaning of Mead paying the price. It does not mean operators have chosen to abandon Mead. It means the river has become too depleted to protect every reservoir's margin at the same time. Powell receives relief because its infrastructure is approaching a vulnerable range. Mead receives less because the water required to create that relief must remain upstream. Flaming Gorge releases additional storage because Powell still needs more support. Each action makes operational sense when viewed locally. Together, they reveal basin-wide scarcity. The system is solving one problem by redistributing another. And the people affected first will not necessarily be those nearest the reservoir. They will be those standing closest to the next threshold, the next shortage tier, the next power contract, the next planting decision, or the next intake that cannot afford to lose another season of recovery. The headline is 6 million acre-feet. The real story is the shrinking distance between normal operation and the moment when one more dry year can no longer be treated as temporary. To understand how that distance disappears, we must follow the water from mountain snow, through dry soil, into the reservoirs, through the dams, and finally into the systems that depend on pressure, timing, and stored elevation to keep functioning. The mechanism begins far above Lake Powell, in mountain snow that appears stable while it is still lying on the ground. That snow is the first storage reservoir in the Colorado River system. It accumulates across winter, holds water at high elevation, and releases it gradually as temperatures rise. For much of the 20th century, that sequence created a familiar operating calendar. Snow built during the cold months. Runoff accelerated in spring. Rivers carried the annual pulse toward the major reservoirs. Powell stored part of it. Glen Canyon Dam released part of it. Mead received the regulated flow and carried water into the hottest part of the year. But the mechanism now moving through the basin is not simply low snowfall. It is a loss of runoff efficiency. That means the mountains can hold a visible amount of snow while the river receives much less water than people expect. Snow is only potential supply. It becomes usable reservoir water only after it survives the journey from the atmosphere to the river. The first obstacle is temperature. A warmer winter can cause snow to fall as rain at lower elevations or melt before the traditional runoff season. A warmer spring can accelerate melting, sending water downhill earlier than storage, and demand schedules were designed around. A hotter atmosphere also pulls more moisture from snow, soil, plants, and open water. Some snow can pass directly into the air through sublimation. Some meltwater evaporates before it reaches a stream. The forecast shows snow. The river receives what remains. Then the water reaches the second obstacle, the ground. After a dry year, mountain soils and surrounding vegetation enter spring with a moisture deficit. Think of that landscape as a dry sponge spread beneath the snowpack. When melting begins, the sponge fills first. Water enters pores in the soil, replenishes shallow groundwater, and is taken up by roots. Only after those demands are partly satisfied does a larger share reach creeks and rivers. This is why an apparently respectable snowpack can produce disappointing runoff. The snow measurement describes what is stored above the soil. It does not guarantee what will pass through the soil. The hidden mechanism is the conversion rate between the two. A basin that once sent a large share of snowmelt into its rivers can send less when the land is hotter and drier. The decline does not require the snow to vanish. It only requires more water to be consumed before it reaches the gauge. From the soil, the surviving water enters small channels. Those channels become tributaries. Tributaries join the Green, the Gunnison, the San Juan, and the main stem of the Colorado. Along the way, some water is diverted for farms and communities. Some returns later through drainage or wastewater systems. Some is stored in smaller reservoirs. Some evaporates. Some supports wetlands, riparian vegetation, and aquatic habitat. By the time the flow reaches Lake Powell, it carries the accumulated result of every process upstream. The reservoir therefore receives not the snowpack shown on a mountain map, but the remainder after an entire landscape has taken its share. In water year 2026, that remainder became small enough for federal operators to treat the forecast as an infrastructure threat. The Bureau of Reclamation reported that the minimum probable inflow to Lake Powell had fallen to about 2.78 million acre-feet, roughly 29% of the historical average. Without major intervention, its April projection showed Powell potentially falling below elevation 3,490 feet by August. That elevation is known as the minimum power pool. It is the approximate level below which Glen Canyon Dam can no longer reliably generate hydropower through its turbines. This is where a hydrologic mechanism becomes a mechanical one. Snow does not reach the river. River inflow does not replace reservoir releases. Storage declines. The water surface moves closer to the turbine limit, and the dam loses part of the vertical pressure required to perform one of its most important functions. Hydropower begins with gravity. Water stored high behind a dam contains potential energy. The greater the vertical distance between the reservoir surface and the turbines, the greater the hydraulic head pushing water through the system. When operators open the route through the power plant, water moves through large pipes called penstocks and spins turbines connected to generators. Electricity enters the regional grid while the water continues downstream. But the turbine does not experience the reservoir as a percentage on a chart. It experiences pressure. As Powell falls, the pressure declines. The same flow can produce less energy. Generating capacity contracts before the reservoir reaches the minimum power pool. At the threshold itself, operators may no longer be able to send water through the power plant as designed. Water deliveries would then depend more heavily on lower bypass structures, creating a different and less flexible operating condition. The danger is not that the dam suddenly becomes a solid wall. The danger is that the routes available for moving water become narrower at the same time the system needs dependable releases. That is why reclamation's response operates in both directions. First, it reduces the amount leaving Lake Powell, lowering the annual release from 7.48 million acre-feet to 6 million, keeps more storage behind Glen Canyon Dam. Every acre-foot retained contributes some amount of elevation, depending on the shape of the reservoir at that level. The purpose is not cosmetic. It is to preserve enough vertical distance above critical infrastructure to maintain water delivery and power operations. Second, the response moves additional stored water toward Powell from upstream facilities, especially Flaming Gorge Reservoir. Under the Drought operations plan, that water travels down the Green River and eventually enters Powell. The process can take weeks because the release must move through hundreds of miles of river channel. It does not arrive as a single block. It becomes a controlled wave stretched across time. Operators must estimate travel speed, downstream channel conditions, environmental requirements, other inflows, and losses along the route. By the time the water becomes visible as additional storage at Powell, the system has already been carrying the intervention for a long distance. This is not new water. That distinction is essential. Releasing water from Flaming Gorge increases flow toward Powell, but it reduces storage at Flaming Gorge. Holding water at Powell protects Glen Canyon Dam, but it reduces the amount scheduled to reach Mead. The mechanism does not solve the shortage. It moves the shortage through space and time. One reservoir gives up water. A second reservoir retains it. A third reservoir receives less. Each movement protects a specific operating function. Yet the basin-wide water balance remains constrained by the same weak runoff. It is like moving emergency batteries through a building during a blackout. One battery can keep a critical room operating, but the transfer leaves another room with less backup. The energy has not increased. The priority has changed. The Colorado River system was designed around the idea that large reservoirs could smooth variation. Wet years would fill storage, dry years would draw it down. Because Powell and Mead together could hold several years of river flow under historical conditions, the system appeared capable of absorbing sequences of drought without immediate disruption. But smoothing only works when recovery years eventually replace what was withdrawn. When hot drought reduces runoff repeatedly, the reservoirs stop functioning as temporary buffers and begin functioning as sources of last resort. Water stored decades earlier is used to compensate for present inflow that never arrives. The system can continue operating, sometimes for years, while its internal margin disappears. That is why the current danger can remain invisible from a city street. There is no sudden wall of dust moving toward Phoenix. There is no alarm sounding in every home in Las Vegas. The mechanism travels quietly. It begins as heat above the snow. It enters the soil as meltwater. It disappears into a moisture deficit. It reaches the river as a smaller flow. It enters Powell as an inadequate refill. It lowers the reservoir toward the turbine threshold. It triggers emergency releases from Flaming Gorge. It causes water to be retained behind Glen Canyon Dam. It arrives at Mead as a missing volume. Then it moves into forecasts, power contracts, shortage calculations, farming decisions, and household costs. By the time the public sees a restriction or a higher bill, the physical process may have been moving through the basin for months or years, and there is a feedback hidden inside this chain. As reservoir surfaces become lower, their direct evaporation may decline because the exposed water area becomes smaller. That offers a limited reduction in losses. But the broader warming that helped reduce runoff continues to increase atmospheric demand across the basin. Plants require more water. Soils dry faster. Snow melts differently. Agricultural demand may rise. Cities experience hotter periods when outdoor water use and electricity consumption increase. The same heat that reduces the amount entering storage can increase the demand placed on what remains. Supply contracts while load grows. That is the configuration operators are trying to manage. It is not merely drought on one side and consumption on the other. It is a compound mechanism in which temperature changes the production of water, the loss of water, and the need for water at the same time. This explains why a single wet season can improve the reservoirs without ending the underlying problem. Heavy snow may raise Powell and Mead. It may restore several feet of elevation and reduce immediate risk. But if the landscape remains warm, if soils begin the next season dry, and if long-term demand remains near or above the river's reduced supply, the gains can be consumed quickly. A wet year becomes relief rather than reset. The reservoir rises, but the operating assumption does not recover with it. This is not just a release cut. This is a reservoir balance failure. The phrase does not mean the river has already stopped functioning. It means the balancing mechanism is being asked to do something it was never designed to do indefinitely. Powell is supposed to regulate upper basin water and help meet downstream obligations. Mead is supposed to store that water for lower basin use. Flaming Gorge is supposed to serve its own regional and operational purposes, while also contributing to the wider system. When all three are used to defend one another against the same persistent deficit, the chain has fewer independent reserves. The backup system becomes part of the primary system. The emergency action becomes the operating plan, and the water keeps moving until it reaches the first person whose decision can no longer be delayed. The first person to feel the 6 million acre foot release may never stand beside Lake Mead. Picture a farm manager in Pinal County, Arizona, walking the edge of a field before sunrise. This is not one named individual, or one documented farm. It is a composite of decisions already familiar across central Arizona, where Colorado River shortages have fallen heavily on agricultural users. The manager is not looking toward Nevada. Lake Mead is hundreds of miles away. The water crisis arrives here as a calendar. Which field can be planted? Which crop can survive on the supply available? Whether a well must run longer? Whether fuel, electricity, seed, fertilizer, and labor can still be justified if the water allocation changes again. The body does not experience reservoir policy as a chart. It experiences it as heat at the edge of a field, dust where irrigation water once moved, and a decision that must be made before the next forecast is certain. The mechanism begins outside this person's control. Runoff into Lake Powell falls far below average. Federal operators retain more water behind Glen Canyon Dam. Lake Mead receives a smaller release than previously scheduled. That change does not immediately identify one farm and close one turnout. Reservoir operations, shortage declarations, legal priorities, state plans, conservation agreements, and local contracts stand between the dam and the field, but the pathway is real. When Mead remains near shortage elevations, Arizona receives less Colorado River water than its full allocation. During the current Tier 1 shortage, the state is absorbing a reduction of 512,000 acre-feet. Arizona water officials have said most of that reduction is carried by agriculture and underground storage programs. The household tap is protected first. The field often receives the warning earlier. This ordering is not accidental. Central Arizona project water does not arrive with equal legal priority for every user. The system carries different classes of water under different contracts and statutes. Some municipal and tribal supplies hold stronger protection. Some agricultural users receive lower priority water and therefore face reductions sooner when the available supply contracts. Scarcity moves through the law before it moves through the canal. That is the detail that changes the picture. A person looking at Mead might assume that everyone loses the same percentage when the lake falls. But the river is not divided like a household bill. It is divided through a century of agreements, court decisions, federal law, contracts, priorities, and negotiated protections. Two people can live under the same dry sky and experience completely different levels of water security. On the farm, the first consequence is uncertainty. Planting is a commitment made months before harvest. Seeds go into the ground before anyone knows whether prices will hold, whether heat will arrive early, or whether the next water forecast will improve. A farmer can respond to reduced surface water by planting fewer acres, changing crops, buying water when available, improving irrigation, or pumping groundwater. Every response has a cost. Leaving land fallow removes production and income. Switching crops may require different equipment, markets, and knowledge. Purchasing water may be too expensive or physically impossible. Efficiency can reduce losses, but it cannot always replace a large supply cut. Pumping groundwater can preserve a crop, but it transfers the pressure beneath the land. The reservoir shortage enters the aquifer. The aquifer then enters the electricity bill because water must be lifted from below ground. If the water table declines, the pump must work harder. Wells may need to be deepened. The energy cost rises. Nearby domestic wells can become less reliable. The original signal began with snow and runoff. It now appears as a motor running longer in the desert. This is how a reservoir balance failure travels through a human decision. From Powell into Mead. From Mead into an Arizona allocation. From the allocation into a canal schedule. From the canal schedule into a planting window. From the planting window into a well. From the well into a power bill. From the power bill into the question of whether the field produces enough revenue to remain active. The water does not simply disappear from agriculture. Its absence changes every calculation surrounding the farm. Consider the route that Colorado River water normally takes before reaching this field. The Central Arizona project begins near Lake Havasu and carries water through a system approximately 336 miles long. Pumps raise that water nearly 3,000 feet as it crosses the desert toward Maricopa, Pinal, and Pima counties. The canal is not a passive river flowing downhill. It is an energy-dependent delivery machine. Electricity moves the water over terrain. Aqueducts, pumping plants, check structures, gates, control rooms, and local distribution systems keep it moving. When the Colorado River supply becomes less certain, the human pathway is also an infrastructure pathway. Water managers must know how much volume will enter the system, when it will arrive, who has priority, and how much energy is required to deliver it. A change at Powell does not shut down this machine. It changes the assumptions under which the machine is scheduled. The farmer may see only a reduced delivery. Inside the system, that reduction has passed through forecast models, reservoir rules, interstate negotiations, federal declarations, cap priority tables, district budgets, and canal operations. By the time it reaches the turnout, the uncertainty has been translated into a number the farm must live with. The field then passes that number forward. Fewer planted acres can mean less work for equipment operators, irrigators, harvest crews, mechanics, truck drivers, processors, and suppliers. A reduction in one farm's production does not automatically create a regional food shortage. Agricultural markets are broader than one county, and farmers adapt in many ways. But concentrated reductions can weaken the local economic network built around farming. A tractor dealership sells fewer parts, a seasonal worker receives fewer hours, a cotton gin or processing facility handles less volume. A local government collects less economic activity from land that once produced a crop. The reservoir signal becomes an income signal. From income, it enters the kitchen. A family does not experience the Colorado River crisis as a line on a Bureau of Reclamation chart. It experiences it when a work season becomes shorter, when a loan becomes harder to repay, or when a young person decides the farm no longer offers a future. But agriculture is only one pathway. Follow the same missing water into a city. A municipal water manager in metropolitan Phoenix may still have enough supply to meet current demand. The city may hold higher priority water, groundwater rights, stored credits, reclaimed water, conservation programs, and agreements designed to protect residents during shortage. The visible experience is normal. A person turns a faucet and water appears. That normality can create the impression that the reservoir decline has no human impact. In reality, the work has moved behind the wall. The city updates drought plans. It calculates how much groundwater can be pumped without undermining long-term goals. It expands wastewater reuse. It offers incentives to remove thirsty landscaping. It negotiates new supply arrangements. It delays or redesigns growth plans. It raises rates to pay for infrastructure that becomes necessary only because older assumptions are less reliable. The household may not lose water today. It may pay more to preserve reliability tomorrow. This is an important evidence line. A lower Powell release does not mean every downstream user immediately loses a proportional amount. It increases pressure inside a system already operating under shortage. The consequences emerge according to priority, location, infrastructure, conservation, and the ability to purchase alternatives. Wealthier communities can often build redundancy. They can finance deeper intakes, treatment plants, reclaimed water systems, conservation programs, storage agreements, and legal teams. Smaller communities may have one well, one distribution network, and little room in the budget. Tribal nations may hold recognized rights while still lacking complete pipelines and household connections needed to put that water to use. Agricultural districts may possess land and infrastructure, but hold water with lower priority. The physical shortage is shared across the basin. The capacity to survive it is not. This unequal pathway is where the human story becomes most visible. The Colorado River does not select victims. The institutions built around it determine where the first reductions land. When Powell is protected and Mead receives less, the water retained upstream does not carry a label saying which person downstream will absorb the difference. The allocation system provides that label later. It may appear in a fallowing agreement. It may appear in a groundwater pumping permit. It may appear in a municipal rate case. It may appear in a postponed housing development or an irrigation district meeting where growers learn that the next year's supply will be smaller than the last. The event is visible at the reservoir. The decision enters a room. For the farm manager in Pinal County, the day may end with no dramatic announcement. The canal still contains water. The pump still runs. Trucks still move along the road. But one field is removed from the planting plan because the water needed to justify it is no longer dependable. That empty field becomes storage of another kind. Water not delivered there may remain elsewhere in the system. The conservation can help protect Mead. It can support cities or postpone a deeper shortage. Yet the cost is concentrated on the person who gives up production. Saving reservoir elevation is not free simply because no concrete breaks. Someone carries the absence. Someone converts water conservation into lost acreage, lost income, or a changed way of life. This is not just a release cut. This is a reservoir balance failure moving through a human chain. The chain begins with less runoff. It passes through the dams. It enters the law. It moves through the canal. It reaches a person before sunrise, standing beside land that can still produce but may no longer receive enough reliable water to make planting rational. And once that decision is repeated across enough fields, wells, cities, and districts, the next vulnerability is no longer the person alone. It is the small piece of infrastructure that every one of those decisions assumes will continue working. The weak point is not the whole Colorado River. The weak point is the shrinking column of water above the machinery at Hoover Dam. Lake Mead can still contain trillions of gallons and remain operationally vulnerable because a reservoir is more than a container. It is part of a machine that depends on elevation. Water stored high behind Hoover Dam creates pressure. That pressure pushes water through intake towers, into massive steel penstocks, and toward turbines inside the power plant. The falling water spins generators. The generators send electricity across the southwest. The water then continues downstream toward Lake Mojave and the diversion systems beyond it. When Mead falls, this pathway does not suddenly disappear. It weakens in stages. The pressure declines. The turbines produce less electricity from the water moving through them. Operators lose flexibility. The distance between the lake surface and the lowest practical operating range becomes smaller. The reservoir is still present, but the machine attached to it is working with less margin. This is the point that a photograph of the shoreline cannot show. The bathtub ring records how far the water has fallen. The power plant measures what that fall has removed. According to the Bureau of Reclamation, Hoover Dam receives water through 4 intake towers, with each tower controlling 1/4 of the supply moving toward the turbines. From those towers, water enters 4 large pressure tunnels and penstocks. The system was built to turn height into power. At higher reservoir levels, the vertical distance between the lake surface and the turbines creates greater hydraulic head. At lower levels, that head declines. The dam can continue generating electricity, especially after upgrades that allow its turbines to operate across a wider range of elevations, but the decline is not harmless. Less head means less available power. A reservoir losing elevation is also a power plant losing capacity. The headline is water. The weak point is pressure. That distinction matters because Hoover Dam is not an isolated generator. Its electricity supports utilities, irrigation districts, municipalities, tribal customers, and other public entities across the region. Hydropower can respond quickly when the grid needs electricity. Operators can increase or reduce generation faster than many thermal plants. That flexibility becomes valuable during hot afternoons when air conditioners drive demand upward, or when another source of power becomes unavailable. As Lake Mead falls, Hoover does not necessarily stop operating, but the amount of dependable power it can provide becomes smaller. The grid loses part of a resource that can react when other resources are under strain. Water shortage begins to behave like an energy shortage, not because every light goes out, but because another margin narrows. Replacement electricity must come from somewhere. Utilities may purchase power from natural gas plants, solar facilities, wind projects, batteries, or the regional market. Each replacement has different costs and operating limits. Solar production can be abundant in the afternoon, but declines toward evening, when heat may still be intense. Wind output changes with weather. Batteries provide flexibility, but remain limited by duration and available charging. Gas plants can respond to demand but require fuel and transmission access. Hydropower from Hoover normally contributes a controllable source inside that mix. When its capacity declines, the grid does not lose all power. It loses options. Systems often become fragile, not when every resource fails, but when too many options disappear at the same time. Now follow that weakness downstream and eastward. Arizona receives Colorado River water through the Central Arizona Project, a 336-mile system of canals, tunnels, pipelines, pumping plants, and control structures. Water enters near Lake Havasu and must be lifted across the desert toward central and southern Arizona. At the Mark Wilmer pumping plant, 6 enormous pumps raise water more than 800 vertical feet before it enters the Buckskin Mountain Tunnel. Across the entire route, the water climbs nearly 3,000 feet. Gravity does not deliver this supply to Phoenix and Tucson. Electricity does. The canal may look like a river, but it functions like a long horizontal machine. Every major lift depends on motors, substations, transmission lines, mechanical equipment, and a precise operating schedule. The weak point is not simply whether water exists in Lake Mead. It is whether the water system can afford and maintain the energy required to move an increasingly constrained supply uphill. Hoover Dam power is not the sole source operating the Central Arizona Project, and a decline at Hoover does not automatically stop the canal. But the two systems occupy the same regional equation. Low reservoir elevations reduce hydropower capability, while drought and extreme heat can increase electricity demand. At the same time, water agencies may need to pump more groundwater, move water through longer routes, or operate treatment and recycling systems more intensely. The amount of water available falls, while the energy required to secure each dependable unit of water can rise. The water system enters the grid enters the water system. A weakness in either one tightens the other. Consider a pumping plant during a long summer heat wave. Outside, temperatures remain above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Homes, stores, warehouses, hospitals, and data centers draw heavily on the electrical grid. Inside the plant, motors must continue lifting Colorado River water toward millions of users. The operators cannot simply pause for several days because electricity is expensive. Water deliveries are scheduled. Canal levels must remain controlled. Treatment plants and local storage facilities depend on predictable flow. If power costs rise, those costs enter agency budgets. If a transmission problem interrupts supply, backup arrangements and operational storage become critical. If water deliveries are reduced, the remaining volume must be assigned according to priority. The small component carrying the pressure may be a transformer, a pump bearing, a control gate, or a high-voltage line feeding one lift station. The system appears enormous. The failure can begin inside one machine room. This is why extended low water conditions create a different kind of infrastructure test from a brief drought. Infrastructure ages according to time, use, heat, vibration, chemical exposure, and maintenance history. A canal system designed to remain wet may react poorly if sections must be dried for long periods. Concrete can crack, seals can deteriorate, mechanical equipment can sit idle and later fail when restarted. Sediment can move differently under reduced flows. Water quality can change as temperatures rise and storage patterns shift. Electrical systems designed for one operating schedule may be asked to cycle differently. None of these consequences is guaranteed by the 6 million acre-foot release. But they describe the load created when a system built around dependable volume must operate under recurring shortage. The weak point is not the whole canal. It is the component that has no easy replacement when the schedule changes. Hoover Dam contains its own version of that problem. The intake towers are monumental structures, but they feed fixed pathways through the dam. The reservoir can move vertically, the concrete cannot. Engineers have expanded the operating range of the power plant through wide head turbines and other upgrades, allowing generation at lower elevations than older equipment could tolerate. That adaptation matters. It moves the threshold downward and buys time. But moving a threshold does not remove the physical relationship between elevation and pressure. Every foot lost still reduces head. Every reduction in head changes the power available from a given flow. Adaptation lengthens the runway. It does not make the runway infinite. The same is true for water intakes used by southern Nevada. As Lake Mead declined during the long drought, the Southern Nevada Water Authority built a third intake deeper in the reservoir and later completed a low lake-level pumping station. Those projects dramatically improved the region's ability to access water at low elevations. They are examples of serious preparation, not evidence that the reservoir level no longer matters. The infrastructure protects the ability to withdraw water. It does not restore the water being withdrawn. A deeper straw can reach the bottom of a glass. It cannot refill the glass. This is the central tension of engineering adaptation throughout the basin. Agencies can deepen intakes, improve turbines, line canals, reuse wastewater, construct storage banks, and install more efficient pumps. Each measure reduces a specific vulnerability, but as physical supply contracts, the system becomes increasingly dependent on every protective component working as intended. Redundancy can improve locally, while basin-wide margin continues to decline. A city with a deep intake may remain secure, while an agricultural district loses surface deliveries. A dam with upgraded turbines may continue generating while producing less power. A canal may keep moving water, while the electricity required to operate it becomes more expensive. The system does not fail everywhere at once. It separates into places with protection and places with exposure. That separation is the human meaning of a weak point. Imagine one transformer serving a pumping station during extreme heat. Transformers operate under thermal limits. High air temperatures make it harder for them to release heat. Heavy electrical load raises internal temperature. If the equipment overheats or fails, the problem is not confined to the substation. Pumps lose power. Canal operations must adjust. Water deliveries may draw more heavily on local storage. Repair crews enter dangerous heat. Replacement equipment may not be immediately available. The emergency crosses from electricity into water, from water into public health, and from public health into the ability of a city to function during the same heat event that increased the original load. No reservoir has to be empty for this chain to begin. It only requires a system operating with less redundancy than before. The danger is not only the peak number. It is the number of backups remaining after the peak arrives. Lake Mead's lost recovery time, therefore, matters because it determines how long these systems remain close to their operating edges. A single low year can be managed with conservation, purchased power, stored groundwater, temporary agreements, and deferred maintenance. Several low years force those temporary measures to overlap. Conservation programs must continue. Power must be purchased again. Groundwater banks are drawn down further. Maintenance windows become harder to schedule. Emergency agreements become part of routine operations. Staff members spend more time preventing immediate failure and less time preparing for the next one. Recovery failure enters the institution. This is where the release cut at Powell becomes more than reservoir accounting. The 1.48 million acre-feet retained upstream represents water that will not provide the previously scheduled support to Mead. Lower basin conservation may replace part of that volume. Tributary inflows may improve the outcome. Demand may fall. But until those gains occur, managers must treat the missing release as a tighter operating condition. They must ask whether Mead will remain high enough to preserve adequate hydropower, whether water users can absorb deeper reductions, whether pumping systems have enough energy, and whether local reserves can bridge another dry season. The 6 million acre-foot decision is moving towards specific pieces of equipment: an intake opening, a turbine runner, a transformer, a pump, a canal gate. A well motor. Any one of them may continue functioning perfectly. The systemic risk lies in how many of them must now carry more responsibility because the reservoirs provide less protection. The weak point is not the whole system. The weak point is the small component that cannot be bypassed when the next layer of backup is already in use. At Hoover Dam, that component may be understood as the remaining hydraulic head above the turbines. In Arizona, it may be the electrical equipment lifting water across the desert. On a farm, it may be the well pump replacing a lost canal delivery. In a small community, it may be a single groundwater well with no redundant connection, different pieces. 1. Mechanism. Less stored elevation reduces power margin. Less power margin raises the value of every alternative. Less surface water increases pumping. More pumping increases energy demand. Higher demand places additional load on the equipment carrying both systems. The map shows 2 reservoirs. The weak point may be a motor no larger than a room, and once the system reaches that level, history is no longer theoretical. The Colorado River has already shown what happens when declining storage pushes emergency engineering, conservation, and reservoir transfers from contingency plans into daily operation. This is not speculation. A version of this mechanism has already left evidence behind. In the summer of 2021, federal water managers were watching Lake Powell approach a range that had once seemed safely distant. The reservoir had fallen through elevation 3,550 feet and continued downward. Forecasts showed a real possibility that it could approach minimum power pool, approximately elevation 3,490 feet, where Glen Canyon Dam would no longer be able to generate hydropower through its turbines as designed. By September, the Bureau of Reclamation reported that some projections placed the probability of Powell falling below minimum power pool in the following years between roughly 25 and 35%. Elevation 3,525 feet, the target that operators wanted to protect, had nearly a 90% chance of being reached during 2022. Those were not predictions of certain failure. They were probabilities describing how quickly the operating margin had disappeared. The first response looked familiar because it used the same logic appearing again today. Water was moved from upstream reservoirs toward Lake Powell. Releases from Flaming Gorge, Blue Mesa, and Navajo reservoirs were adjusted under Drought Response Authority. The objective was to increase Powell's elevation and reduce the risk to water delivery and power production. Operators were not ending the drought, they were assembling enough stored water to defend a critical line. That distinction became unavoidable in 2022. In March of that year, Lake Powell fell below elevation 3,525 feet. The surface was less than 35 feet above minimum power pool. 35 feet may sound like a meaningful distance when imagined beside a person or a building. Inside a reservoir system moving millions of acre-feet, it was a thin, operational margin. One poor runoff season could consume it. A sequence of monthly release decisions could consume it. An unusually hot and dry spring could consume it before managers had time to negotiate another response. The reservoir was still immense. The warning came from the small vertical distance remaining above the machinery. In April 2022, the Department of the Interior approved a drought response plan that called for approximately 500,000 acre-feet of additional water to be released from Flaming Gorge between May 2022 and April 2023. That volume would travel downstream through the Green River and eventually enter Lake Powell. At the same time, another emergency action retained 480,000 acre-feet at Powell by reducing the annual volume scheduled to pass through Glen Canyon Dam. Together, the two measures were expected to add approximately 1 million acre-feet of storage to Powell, equivalent at the time to roughly 16 feet of elevation. 16 feet was the headline benefit. The hidden mechanism was the transfer. Flaming Gorge lost storage. Powell gained protection. Mead received less water than it would have under the original schedule. The same architecture now visible in 2026 was already operating. One reservoir was used to support another, and the downstream reservoir absorbed part of the adjustment. The action worked in its immediate purpose. It created additional distance above Powell's critical range. It preserved time for operators to manage releases and monitor the next runoff season. It reduced the probability of an abrupt loss of hydropower at Glen Canyon Dam. But it also demonstrated the limits of emergency reservoir transfers. The 500,000 acre-feet sent from Flaming Gorge was water accumulated during earlier years. Once released, it could not be used again unless future runoff replaced it. The 480,000 acre-feet held at Powell improved Powell's condition, but it was accounted for in the operating calculation at Mead because the system could not pretend the missing downstream release had no consequence. The water was useful, the intervention was real, the shortage remained. Downstream, Lake Mead crossed its own historic lines. In August 2021, Reclamation declared the first shortage condition in the history of the Lower Colorado River operating rules. For calendar year 2022, Arizona received the largest reduction, with additional reductions assigned to Nevada and Mexico under existing agreements. The cuts did not affect every user equally. Lower priority, Central Arizona Project, supplies carried much of Arizona's reduction, pushing the first large effects toward agriculture and water banking rather than immediately into urban household deliveries. The reservoir signal moved through legal priority, then through canal schedules, and finally into fields. This was not a theory about what low storage might someday do. Land was fallowed. Groundwater pumping increased in exposed agricultural areas. Water agencies accelerated conservation and contingency planning. The human pathway had begun, while most urban taps continued to function normally. Then the system moved into a deeper stage. In August 2022, Reclamation projected that Lake Mead would begin 2023 at an operating determination elevation of approximately 1,047.61 feet. That triggered the first Level 2A shortage condition. Arizona's reduction increased to 592,000 acre-feet. Nevada's reduction reached 25,000 acre-feet. Mexico's reduction reached 104,000 acre-feet. California did not take a mandatory shortage reduction under that tier because of the legal priority structure governing lower basin deliveries. The physical river was shrinking, but the consequences were distributed by rules written long before the current drought. That is the precedent the present decision must be compared against. A reservoir can fall for everyone while the first losses concentrate on particular users. The water shortage may be regional. The economic damage is selective. The 2023 determination also revealed how operators tried to preserve neutrality between Powell and Mead. The official calculation for Mead included the 480,000 acre-feet that had been retained at Powell. In other words, federal managers recognized that Mead's physical elevation was lower because water had been held upstream for emergency protection. The accounting adjustment prevented that single intervention from automatically causing an additional legal shortage consequence at Mead, but accounting could not raise the physical water surface. The rule could preserve fairness in the operating determination. It could not send the retained water through the Grand Canyon. Mead still had less physical storage than it would have received under the original release schedule. This is one of the most important lessons from the earlier crisis. Water law can determine how a shortage is declared. It cannot eliminate the hydraulic effect of moving water from one reservoir to another. By late 2022, the danger had expanded beyond existing shortage rules. Reclamation asked the lower basin states to develop major additional conservation because projections showed that ordinary reductions might not be enough to protect critical elevations. Federal officials discussed the need for conserving between 2 million and 4 million acre-feet in 2023, on top of existing commitments. The scale of that request exposed how far the system had moved outside the conditions anticipated when earlier guidelines were written. A few 100,000 acre-feet had once been treated as a major adjustment. Now officials were discussing several million. The reservoir emergency was no longer only about crossing one shortage tier. It was about preventing the storage system from moving toward ranges where the basic operation of the dams could become uncertain. Then the atmosphere changed the story. The winter of 2022 into 2023 produced a large snowpack across much of the upper Colorado River basin. Spring runoff into Lake Powell rose sharply. Reclamation projected more than 14 million acre-feet of inflow during water year 2023, greater than the combined inflow of the preceding 3 water years. Powell rose. The immediate need for another release from upstream reservoirs disappeared for that drought response year. The visual transformation was dramatic. Boat ramps reopened. Shorelines changed. The distance above minimum power pool increased. Mead also benefited from improved operations, conservation, and a better water balance. For a moment, the system appeared to step away from the edge. But that wet year did not erase the precedent. It clarified it. A strong runoff season could rescue elevation quickly because the reservoirs had fallen so far. Yet the same increase could be misread as full recovery. Powell remained well below full capacity. Mead remained under shortage conditions. Emergency conservation programs continued. Negotiations over post-2026 rules became more urgent, not less. The snowpack had provided water. It had not repaired the structural imbalance between long-term use and the amount the river could reliably supply under a warmer climate. The event passed. The operating question remained. This is where the 2021 through 2023 period resembles the current crisis. In both cases, runoff weakened enough to threaten Powell's critical elevations. In both cases, Flaming Gorge became an emergency source of support. In both cases, water was retained at Powell by reducing what moved toward Mead. In both cases, the action protected infrastructure rather than creating new basin-wide supply. And in both cases, the immediate benefit upstream produced a physical consequence downstream. The mechanism is the same because the reservoirs remain connected in the same order. Water saved at Powell cannot simultaneously raise Mead. Water released from Flaming Gorge cannot simultaneously remain stored at Flaming Gorge. The system can choose where the margin sits. It cannot place the same margin in 3 reservoirs at once. But the present is not an exact repetition of 2022. Flaming Gorge entered the new operation with a different storage condition. Conservation agreements have changed the balance at Mead. Turbine upgrades and engineering adaptations have expanded some operating ranges. Agencies have accumulated more experience managing emergency releases. Cities and irrigation districts have added conservation tools. The post-2026 negotiations are now directly confronting scenarios that older rules treated as remote. Those differences matter. They mean the outcome is not predetermined. The basin is not mechanically repeating a past disaster. It is entering a familiar mechanism with a changed set of defenses. The troubling difference is that the defenses themselves have already been used. Emergency reservoir transfers are no longer an untested backup. Reduced releases from Powell are no longer unprecedented. Paid conservation in the lower basin is no longer a temporary experiment. Shortage declarations are no longer theoretical. Every action that once represented the outer edge of planning has moved closer to routine operation. That creates institutional knowledge, but it also reveals how little unused margin remains. A backup plan can be reassuring the first time it is activated. When it must be activated repeatedly, it becomes evidence that the primary system is no longer sufficient. The lesson from 2023 is not that one snowy winter will always arrive in time. It is that favorable hydrology can interrupt the decline without resolving the mechanism that caused it. The lesson from 2022 is not that emergency transfers are ineffective. They protected Powell when protection was urgently needed. The lesson is that every transfer carries a cost somewhere else, and every saved foot must eventually be supported by real inflow. History does not say Lake Mead must now follow the same path or reach the same elevation. It says the current strategy has already been tested, and its limits are visible. It can move risk. It can delay thresholds. It can protect turbines. It can buy a season. What it cannot do is make 1 acre-foot occupy 2 reservoirs at the same time. The precedent therefore leaves one question behind. If the next wet year provides relief but not a reset, how many times can the basin repeat this rescue before emergency operations become the only operations it has left? The system pattern becomes visible when an emergency action stops looking exceptional. A release reduction from Lake Powell can be explained as a response to one dry runoff season. Water from Flaming Gorge can be explained as temporary protection for Glen Canyon Dam. Conservation at Lake Mead can be explained as a bridge to better hydrology. Each explanation is reasonable on its own, but place the actions beside one another, and a larger configuration appears. The Colorado River is repeatedly using temporary measures to perform the work that normal reservoir recovery once performed. This is not only a release cut, it is a calendar failure. The system was built around a sequence in which winter snow created spring runoff. Spring runoff rebuilt storage, and stored water carried the basin through summer and drought. The dates still arrive in the same order. The hydrology does not always follow them. Snow may accumulate, but produce less runoff. Runoff may arrive earlier. Soil may absorb a larger share. A wet year may raise the reservoirs without replacing the storage lost during several dry years. The calendar says recovery season. The reservoirs receive partial recovery. That difference forces operators to intervene between the seasons. Water is moved from Flaming Gorge. Releases at Glen Canyon Dam are reduced. Lower basin users are paid to conserve. Forecasts are updated more frequently. Emergency authorities become part of ordinary planning. The river is no longer only delivering water. It is delivering uncertainty on a schedule the old rules were not designed to manage. The current operating guidelines were built after years of negotiation and were adopted to coordinate Powell and Mead through shortage. They use reservoir elevations, release tiers, and shortage levels to determine how water moves and when reductions begin. Those rules created order during a period when the basin needed predictable responses. But predictability depends on the range of conditions remaining inside what the rules anticipated. When both reservoirs approach critical ranges together, the logic becomes harder. Powell may need water retained to protect its power pool and delivery capability. Mead may need that same water to protect lower basin storage and hydropower. The old balancing concept assumes that the condition of one reservoir can help guide operations at the other. The present problem is that both can be weak at the same time. The system was built to balance two accounts. It is now confronting the possibility that neither account contains enough surplus to balance the other. That is why the federal government's post-2026 process matters. The Bureau of Reclamation has released a draft environmental analysis examining a range of possible operating strategies for Lake Powell and Lake Mead after the current guidelines expire. The alternatives differ in how they measure system conditions, how they determine releases, how they distribute reductions, and how they respond when storage becomes dangerously low. No final rule should be treated as certain at this stage. The draft is an evaluation, not the last decision. But the range of scenarios being studied reveals what the operating system must now prepare for. Future rules cannot rely only on the assumption that a familiar sequence of wet and dry years will restore the reservoirs before critical thresholds arrive. They must remain functional across wider hydrologic uncertainty, including conditions in which inflow stays low for long periods, and the two major reservoirs continue losing storage together. That requirement changes the meaning of normal. In the 20th century, planners could look at historical river records and estimate a range of supply. Those records remain valuable, but they describe a climate that was generally cooler than the one now controlling snow, soil moisture, evaporation, and plant demand. The past still tells operators how the river behaved. It no longer guarantees the boundaries of how the river will behave. A new baseline does not mean every future year will be dry. Some years will be wet. Some snowpacks will be large. Reservoirs may rise quickly under favorable conditions. The change is that the same amount of precipitation can produce a different amount of runoff, and a wet year may be surrounded by hotter years that consume its gains faster. Variability remains. The floor beneath that variability may be moving. This creates a preparation problem for every system connected to the river. Farmers make planting decisions months before the final runoff volume is known. Cities plan treatment plants, housing, and pipelines across decades. Power agencies sign contracts and build generation resources for years of operation. tribal nations pursue settlements and infrastructure that may take decades to complete. Environmental programs depend on the timing and temperature of flows through river habitat. Recreation businesses invest in marinas, ramps, hotels, and equipment based on expected access to the reservoirs. None of these systems can be rebuilt every time a forecast changes. They need rules stable enough for planning and flexible enough for hydrology that no longer behaves within the old calendar. Those two demands pull in opposite directions. Stability requires commitments. Flexibility requires the ability to change them. The 6 million acre-foot release is a preview of that conflict. Reclamation changed the annual release because updated conditions made the earlier plan too risky for Powell. Operational flexibility protected the dam, but every downstream user had made plans around an expected range of releases. The correction upstream became uncertainty downstream. Future rules must decide how quickly such corrections occur, which measurements trigger them, who absorbs the first reduction, and whether the system responds to the elevation of one reservoir or the combined condition of both. Those are not merely technical questions. Each formula distributes security and loss. A rule based on Mead's elevation may expose one group. A rule based on total system storage may distribute reductions differently. A rule protecting minimum power pools may preserve dam operations while requiring larger conservation elsewhere. A rule that delays cuts may protect current users while increasing the probability of deeper restrictions later. Mathematics can make the decision consistent. It cannot make the trade-off disappear. This is not only a water supply problem. It is a recovery capacity problem. The agencies responsible for the river can respond to one emergency with staff, funding, agreements, and temporary engineering. Repeated emergencies create a different load. Negotiators remain in continuous talks. Forecast models must cover wider ranges. Water districts repeatedly revise budgets. Conservation programs must be extended or replaced. Farmers cannot treat fallowing as temporary if the water does not reliably return. Communities cannot depend on emergency grants as a permanent source of infrastructure funding. The response system itself can become overloaded. When every year requires an exception, the exception becomes the baseline, but the institutions may still be staffed and financed as though normal operations will resume. Recovery failure reaches the office before it reaches the intake. It appears as delayed maintenance, exhausted personnel, temporary contracts renewed again, and major investments postponed because the next operating rule remains uncertain. The risk also moves between seasons. Historically, attention concentrates on winter snowpack and spring runoff. But a warmer basin makes autumn soil moisture more important because dry soil can consume the following spring's melt. Hot summers raise evaporation and demand. Warm nights increase electricity use for cooling, adding load to a grid connected to declining hydropower. Wildfire can damage watersheds, change erosion, and send sediment into streams and reservoirs during later storms. Drought can therefore enter the water system before the snow falls and continue affecting it after runoff ends. The operational year begins carrying memory from the year before. A dry autumn becomes a hidden claim on spring snow. A hot summer becomes a claim on reservoir storage and electricity. The calendar no longer separates the hazards cleanly. They overlap. Geography changes too. The most visible crisis may sit at Powell or Mead, but the risk moves toward whichever system has the least alternative supply. A large city with conservation programs, groundwater storage, recycled water, and financial capacity may absorb another reduction. A rural community with one well may not. A senior water user may continue receiving deliveries, while a junior user loses most of its allocation. A hydropower customer may replace reduced federal power at higher cost. A small irrigation district may lack that option. The new baseline is not one uniform level of suffering. It is a wider separation between systems that can buy resilience and systems that cannot. This is how basin-wide shortage becomes local inequality. The river falls for everyone. The ability to respond depends on infrastructure, law, money, and position in the priority system. Yet the pattern does not point only toward collapse. It also reveals where adaptation can change the outcome. Conservation in the lower basin has already left meaningful volumes in Lake Mead. Cities have reduced per-person water use even while populations grew. Nevada has expanded reuse and constructed infrastructure capable of withdrawing water at very low reservoir elevations. Agricultural agreements can compensate users for temporary reductions. Turbine upgrades have extended the operating range of the dams. Forecasting has improved. Tribal participation in basin discussions has received greater formal attention, though large inequities remain. These actions matter because the future is not controlled by hydrology alone. The amount of water available sets the boundary. Human decisions determine how violently the system meets it. But adaptation must be measured honestly. A deeper intake protects access. It does not create supply. More efficient irrigation can reduce withdrawals. But efficiency does not guarantee basin savings if conserved water supports expanded use elsewhere. Paid fallowing can preserve reservoir elevation, but communities cannot indefinitely remove agricultural production without economic consequences. Moving water among reservoirs can defend infrastructure, but every transfer reduces storage at another location. The evidence line must remain clear. Adaptation can reduce damage. It cannot repeal the water balance. The new system will therefore be judged by whether it reacts before emergency thresholds become imminent. Old preparation often waited for reservoir elevations to trigger action. Future preparation may need to respond to the rate of decline, combined storage, runoff efficiency, soil moisture, and the probability of several dry years arriving in sequence. A reservoir can remain above a threshold today while moving toward it too quickly for a safe response tomorrow. The peak number is no longer enough. Direction and recovery time become equally important. 6 million acre-feet is one decision inside that transition. It shows that operators are willing to rewrite the release schedule when Powell's infrastructure comes under threat. It also shows the cost of acting late when the available choices are reduced to shifting water among depleted reserves. The map shows two reservoirs. The system is failing at the assumption that one can always rescue the other. The future rule cannot be designed only to decide which lake loses water first. It must decide how the entire basin reduces demand before both lakes require rescue at once. And that leads to the final boundary of this story. The evidence is strong enough to show a system under structural pressure. It is not strong enough to declare one inevitable ending. What happens next depends on weather, conservation, law, engineering, and choices that have not yet been made. Return to the operating table where this story began. One line once showed 7.48 million acre-feet. That line now shows 6 million. The change is easy to state. Its meaning is harder to contain. Lake Powell will retain 1.48 million acre-feet that had previously been scheduled to move through Glen Canyon Dam toward Lake Mead. Additional water is being released from Flaming Gorge to support Powell. Forecast inflow to Powell remains far below average. Federal operators are acting to protect critical elevations, water delivery, and hydropower. Those facts are connected. They are official. They are enough to establish that the Colorado River storage system is under severe operational pressure. But the warning does not need exaggeration. The evidence is already enough. The release reduction does not prove that Lake Mead will reach dead pool. It does not prove that Hoover Dam will stop generating electricity. It does not mean Las Vegas, Phoenix, Los Angeles, or any other city is about to lose all water. It does not establish that every fallowed field, higher water bill, groundwater decline, or power market change is caused by this single decision. Lake Mead is influenced by water use, conservation, tributary inflow, evaporation, rainfall, releases downstream, return flows, and future operating choices. Powell is influenced by snow, soil moisture, temperature, upstream withdrawals, reservoir releases, and the timing of runoff. The two reservoirs are linked, but neither is controlled by one number alone. That boundary matters because a real system risk can be weakened by claims that go beyond the evidence. The 6 million acre-foot release is not a prophecy. It is a response to a forecast. A forecast describes a range of possible conditions using the best observations and models available at the time. It can improve. It can worsen. Storms can arrive. Temperatures can change. Runoff measurements can revise earlier estimates. Conservation can leave more water in Mead. Demand can fall. Future operating decisions can shift releases again. None of those possibilities should be ignored. Uncertainty does not mean the warning is false. It means the outcome remains partly open. That is exactly why the decision matters now. Operators do not wait for a reservoir to cross a critical threshold before taking every protective action. By then, the safest options may already be gone. They act while there is still distance to preserve, water to reposition, and time to buy. The evidence supports a precise conclusion. Powell is being protected because the risk of continued decline has become serious enough to justify retaining more water and drawing support from an upstream reservoir. The physical consequence is that Mead receives less water than it would have under the original release schedule. The basin-wide consequence is that storage and risk are being redistributed rather than eliminated. That is the line the evidence can support. Beyond it, certainty disappears. We do not know exactly how the next snow season will behave. We do not know which post-2026 operating alternative will become final policy. We do not know how much voluntary or compensated conservation will remain in Mead. We do not know whether one wet year will interrupt the decline or whether several dry years will deepen it. We do know that the system is entering those unknowns with less margin than its infrastructure once provided. That is the real risk, not a guaranteed collapse, a reduced ability to absorb surprise. The distinction between causation and coincidence matters here too. A hot summer can increase electricity demand, while reservoir levels reduce hydropower capacity. Those conditions can occur together and create compound pressure. But a blackout during that summer would not automatically be caused by Lake Mead. Grid failures can involve transmission damage, plant outages, fuel constraints, equipment failure, market conditions, wildfire, or extreme demand. Low hydropower can remove flexibility without being the single cause of an outage. In the same way, groundwater pumping can rise when surface water deliveries are reduced. But groundwater decline may also reflect long-standing local use, development, agricultural demand, and previous policy. The Colorado River shortage can intensify an existing problem without creating every part of it. Evidence becomes stronger when the claim remains proportional. The release cut increases downstream pressure. It does not explain every downstream failure. The same discipline applies to climate. A single dry year cannot be attributed entirely to climate change. The Colorado River has always experienced drought, variable snow, and long periods of low flow. Natural variability remains powerful, but warming changes the background conditions through which that variability moves. Higher temperatures can reduce snow persistence, increase atmospheric demand, dry soils, increase evaporation, and lower the share of precipitation that becomes runoff. Climate change does not need to produce every storm or every dry season to increase the probability that a dry period leaves deeper damage. The relationship is not that warming creates one bad forecast. It is that warming can make the basin less efficient at converting precipitation into stored water and less capable of recovering after shortages. That is a system-level conclusion, not a claim that one year has one cause. The river's legal structure also requires careful language. It is tempting to say the Colorado River is simply over-allocated, and at a broad level, the basin has often promised and consumed more water than recent, long-term flows can reliably support. But actual use, legal entitlement, treaty obligations, tribal rights, reservoir rules, conservation programs, and shortage reductions do not form one simple total. Some rights remain undeveloped. Some users consume less than their full entitlement. Some water returns to the river after use. Some conservation is temporary, some reductions are mandatory, and others negotiated. The system cannot be understood by adding every paper entitlement as though all water were consumed in the same place and at the same time. Yet complexity does not erase the central arithmetic. Over the long term, The basin cannot release, divert, and consume more water than the watershed produces without drawing down storage. Reservoirs can hide that imbalance for years. They cannot hide it forever. Lake Powell and Lake Mead were built to convert variable river flow into reliable supply. Their enormous storage allowed wet years to support dry ones. That design was successful enough to create cities, farms, power systems, and expectations that now depend on the reservoirs continuing to perform. The danger is not that the dams failed to store water. The danger is that their success encouraged the basin to treat stored water as though it were permanent annual income. Storage is not income. It is memory. It is water from an earlier season held for a later one. When withdrawals repeatedly exceed new deposits, the reservoir is spending its memory. The white rings on the canyon walls are the visible record of that spending. But the future is not written only in those rings. It is also being written in conservation programs, new operating rules, tribal negotiations, agricultural agreements, urban reuse, turbine upgrades, deeper intakes, groundwater protections, and decisions about which demands can change before infrastructure reaches its limits. None of those measures is sufficient alone. Together, they can determine whether the basin responds through planned reduction or emergency loss. That is the choice hidden beneath the 6 million acre-foot number. The river will provide whatever the mountains, soil, atmosphere, and climate allow. Policy decides whether demand meets that supply gradually or crashes into it at a threshold. A managed reduction can still be painful. A farmer may leave land unplanted. A city may spend billions on reuse. A household may pay a higher rate. A power customer may lose inexpensive hydropower. A community may have to reject growth that its water system cannot support. Those are real costs. But planned costs can be distributed, negotiated, compensated, and adjusted over time. Emergency failure offers fewer choices. It concentrates damage on whoever stands nearest the weak point when the margin disappears. The objective of future rules should not be to preserve every old promise unchanged. The river no longer offers that certainty. The objective should be to prevent physical thresholds from making decisions that people refuse to make earlier. Lake Powell's release reduction is therefore both an intervention and a message. The intervention protects elevation at one reservoir. The message is that the old operating pattern cannot continue without repeated rescue. Flaming Gorge can support Powell, but Flaming Gorge is not an unlimited source. Powell can retain water, but Mead cannot receive the same water at the same time. Mead can be supported through conservation, but conservation must be renewed, expanded, or converted into lasting demand reduction. Engineering can extend operating ranges, but machinery cannot generate water. Each tool buys something valuable. None of them removes the need for balance. This is not just a release cut. This is a reservoir balance failure. The phrase does not mean the basin has reached its final state. It means the balancing system has become dependent on transferring pressure among reservoirs, users, seasons, and institutions. The release cut transfers pressure to Mead. Conservation transfers pressure to farms, cities, and public budgets. Groundwater pumping transfers pressure beneath the land. Replacement electricity transfers pressure to the grid and power markets. Deferred maintenance transfers pressure into the future. Every avoided consequence has a location where its cost reappears. The central question is whether those transfers are creating a durable transition or merely delaying the same confrontation. That answer has not been decided. The post-2026 process is still attempting to define how Powell and Mead will be operated after the current rules expire. The alternatives examine different ways of coordinating releases, measuring system conditions, protecting critical elevations, and distributing reductions. No formula can guarantee snow, but a rule can act earlier. It can use combined storage instead of waiting for one lake to cross a line. It can reduce demand before emergency transfers become necessary. It can recognize that protecting infrastructure and protecting communities are connected tasks. It can include people whose rights and interests were historically excluded from the decisions shaping the river. It can make uncertainty part of the operating design instead of treating every bad forecast as an exception. Return one final time to the number on the official table. 6 million acre-feet will still sound enormous. It is enormous. It can support rivers, power, agriculture, cities, and ecosystems across a vast region. But the number no longer represents abundance by itself. It represents a choice about where limited water remains. Powell receives more protection. Mead receives less recovery. Flaming Gorge contributes storage. Downstream users search for the difference. The event will pass. The release schedule will eventually change. Snow will return in some years. Reservoirs will rise, and photographs may again show water covering parts of the exposed canyon. But the thing revealed by this decision will remain. A system built around large reserves is now deciding which reserve must carry the next shortage. The future of the Colorado River will not be determined only by whether Powell stays above one elevation or Mead avoids another. It will be determined by whether the basin can reduce the load before every remaining buffer is assigned to an emergency. The final warning is not that the river is disappearing tomorrow, it is that recovery time is disappearing today. And when the next official number appears on the operating table, the most important question will not be how much water one reservoir gained. It will be what part of the system had to pay for it.